The year was 1968, and the streets of Harlem hummed with a dangerous electricity that only those who lived and breathed its asphalt veins could truly understand. In the smoky backrooms of after-hours clubs, where jazz melodies mingled with the acrid scent of fear and ambition, a young man named Frank Lucas was about to make a decision that would reshape the entire criminal underworld of New York City. But to understand the magnitude of that choice, you have to understand what Harlem was in those days. A kingdom built on numbers, narcotics, and the iron will of men who refused to accept the limitations that society had placed upon them. Frank Lucas had arrived in Harlem years earlier, a country boy from North Carolina, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a burning desire to be something more than what the Jim Crow South had predetermined for him. He was born in LaGrange, North Carolina, in 1930, into a world that told black men they were worth less than nothing, where a wrong look at a white woman could get you lynched, and where economic opportunity was as scarce as water in a desert. His early years were marked by poverty so grinding that it became a physical thing, a weight that pressed down on his family's shoulders every single day. His father was a sharecropper, a man who worked himself to the bone in fields he would never own, growing crops that would fill bellies he would never sit at the table with. The Lucas family lived in a wooden shack that let in the winter cold and the summer heat with equal indifference. Frank watched his mother stretch pennies until they screamed, watched his father come home with his back bent and his hands bleeding, watched as the white landowners grew fat while his own siblings went to bed hungry. It was an education in injustice, a masterclass in how the world worked for some people and didn't work for others, and Frank Lucas, even as a boy, paid attention. He watched everything, memorized everything, calculated everything. The moment that changed Frank's life forever came when he was just 6 years old, an incident seared into his memory with such clarity that he could recall every detail decades later. His cousin, a young man who had committed the unforgivable sin of talking back to a white man, was beaten to death by members of the Ku Klux Klan. They didn't just kill him, they made a spectacle of it, a warning to every black person in LaGrange about what happened when you forgot your place. Frank watched as the men in white hoods walked away laughing, watched as the sheriff did absolutely nothing, watched as his family buried his cousin in a grave that nobody would ever be held accountable for filling. Something hardened in Frank Lucas that day, a calcification of the soul that turned grief into determination and fear into cold, calculated fury. He understood with a clarity that most children never achieve, that the law was not designed to protect people who looked like him. He understood that the system was rigged, that playing by the rules meant accepting a life of subservience and poverty, that the only way to win a game where the deck was stacked against you was to change the rules entirely. By the time Frank was a teenager, he had already started down a path that would define the rest of his life. He began with small crimes, petty thefts, and scams that taught him the fundamentals of criminal enterprise. He stole from local stores, ran cons on unsuspecting marks, and developed a reputation as someone who was smarter than average, more calculating, more willing to take risks. But North Carolina was too small for his ambitions, too constrained by the suffocating racism of the South, too limited in its opportunities for the kind of success he envisioned. In 1946, at the age of 16, Frank Lucas made his way north. He rode the rails like thousands of other black Americans during the Great Migration, part of that massive movement of people fleeing the South's brutality for the promise of northern cities. He arrived in New York City with nothing, knowing nobody, understanding nothing about the complex ecosystem of urban crime that he was about to enter. But Frank had something that money couldn't buy and connections couldn't provide. He had hunger. Not the kind of hunger that comes from missing a few meals, but the deep, existential hunger of a man who had decided that he would rather die than remain insane. Efficient, Harlem in the late 1940s was a world unto itself, a black metropolis within the larger white city, a place where jazz was born and dreams came to die, or occasionally, spectacularly, came true. It was controlled by a complex hierarchy of criminals, numbers runners, pimps, and enforcers, all operating under the watchful eye of the Italian Mafia, who controlled the distribution of heroin in the city. At the top of Harlem's criminal food chain was a man named Ellsworth Raymond Johnson, though everyone who knew him called him Bumpy. Bumpy Johnson was a legend, a king in a kingdom that existed in the shadows. He controlled the numbers racket, the illegal lottery that was the economic lifeblood of Harlem's underground economy. He was a man who commanded respect through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and a certain code of conduct that made him something more than just a common criminal. Bumpy took care of his community in ways that the government never did. He paid for kids to go to school, helped families who were struggling, and maintained a kind of order in the chaos of Harlem's streets. He was feared, certainly, but he was also loved in a way that few criminals ever achieve. Frank Lucas met Bumpy Johnson in the early 1950s, and the encounter changed everything. Frank was working as a low-level hustler, running errands and doing odd jobs for various criminals, when he caught Bumpy's attention. What Bumpy saw in Frank was what Frank had always known was there: a mind that worked differently, a willingness to do whatever was necessary, and a complete absence of the sentimentality that got so many criminals caught or killed. Bumpy took Frank under his wing, not as a son exactly, but as a protege, someone he could mold and shape and teach the intricate art of criminal enterprise. For the next 15 years, Frank Lucas learned at the feet of a master. Bumpy taught him how to read people, how to identify weaknesses and exploit them without mercy. He taught him about loyalty and betrayal, about when to be generous and when to be cruel, about the importance of maintaining respect even as you inspired fear. Bumpy showed Frank how the criminal ecosystem of New York worked, how the Italian Mafia controlled the heroin trade but allowed black criminals to operate as distributors in their own communities, how everyone paid tribute up the chain, how the police and politicians were just another part of the business that needed to be managed. But Bumpy also taught Frank something more fundamental. He showed him that there were limits to power when you accepted someone else's rules. The Italians controlled the supply of heroin, which meant they controlled the profits. They decided who got to sell, how much they could sell, and at what price. Bumpy had built a kingdom within those constraints, but it was still a kingdom built on someone else's land. Frank watched and learned and quietly, secretly, began to dream of something different. By 1968, Bumpy Johnson was in his 60s and his health was failing. The years of stress, violence, and the constant chess game of criminal enterprise had taken their toll. He had survived assassination attempts, prison sentences, and countless betrayals. But time was the one enemy even Bumpy Johnson couldn't defeat. He knew his reign was coming to an end, and he needed to think about succession, about who would take over the empire he had built. Frank Lucas, by this time, was one of Bumpy's most trusted lieutenants. He had proven himself time and again, handling difficult situations with a combination of intelligence and ruthlessness that Bumpy appreciated. He ran operations with military precision, solved problems before they became crises, and generated profits with a consistency that made him invaluable. In the complex hierarchy of Bumpy's organization, Frank had risen to a position where he could see the entire operation, understand how all the pieces fit together, and more importantly, see where the weaknesses were. The offer came on a humid summer evening in one of Bumpy's regular haunts, a club in Harlem where the powerful came to be seen and the ambitious came to observe. Bumpy called Frank to a private room in the back, a space where the music from the main floor was muffled and distant, where serious business was conducted away from prying eyes and listening ears. The room smelled of cigar smoke and expensive cologne, and the walls seemed to absorb sound, creating a bubble of privacy in the midst of the city's chaos. Bumpy was sitting in a leather chair that looked almost like a throne, his face showing the wear of his years, but his eyes still sharp and calculating. He gestured for Frank to sit, and for a long moment, the two men just looked at each other, master and student, mentor and protege, king and potential heir. Then Bumpy began to speak, his voice still commanding despite the illness that was slowly consuming him from within. The offer was simple in its surface details, but staggering in its implications. Bumpy wanted Frank to take over a significant portion of his operations, to become the primary distributor of heroin in Harlem, to step into a role that would instantly make him one of the most powerful criminals in New York City. It was everything Frank had worked for, everything he had been building toward for 15 years. The money would be extraordinary, conservatively estimated at over $1 million a year, a fortune by any standard, but especially for a black man in 1968 America. But the offer came with conditions, with constraints that Bumpy presented as the natural order of things, as the way business had always been done and would always continue to be done. Frank would have to maintain the existing relationships with the Italian Mafia, buy his heroin from their suppliers at their prices, operate within their system, and pay tribute up the chain. He would be powerful, yes, but his power would always be subordinate to theirs. He would be wealthy, certainly, but his wealth would always be dependent on their approval. He would be a king, but only in a kingdom that existed at the pleasure of emperors. Bumpy explained it all with the patience of a teacher, laying out how the system worked, why it had to work that way, how Frank would benefit from accepting his place within it. He talked about the importance of maintaining relationships, about not rocking the boat, about understanding that there were some things you couldn't change, and that trying to change them would only get you killed. It was a reasonable offer, a generous offer, the kind of opportunity that most men in Frank's position would have accepted without hesitation. Frank listened to everything Bumpy said, his face revealing nothing, his mind working through all the angles and implications. He had known this moment was coming, had prepared for it in ways that even Bumpy didn't fully understand. He had spent years watching, learning, calculating, and planning. He had identified every weakness in the existing system, every inefficiency, every place where money was being left on the table because of outdated arrangements and traditional ways of doing business. The heroin that flooded Harlem's streets came from Turkey, was processed in France, and was imported by the Italian Mafia who controlled the ports in New York. By the time it reached distributors like Frank, it had passed through so many hands, been cut so many times, and been marked up at every stage that the final product was barely 10% pure. The addicts were getting garbage, paying premium prices for heroin that had been adulterated so many times it was more filler than drug, and everyone along the chain was taking their cut: the Turks, the Corsicans, the Italians, and finally the black distributors who got the smallest piece of the pie despite doing the most dangerous work. Frank had been thinking about this for years, turning the problem over in his mind like a Rubik's Cube, looking for the solution that everyone else had missed because they were too invested in the way things had always been done. And he had found it, a solution so audacious, so unprecedented, that even suggesting it out loud seemed like madness. But Frank Lucas had been born into a world that told him he was less than human, had watched his cousin murdered by men who faced no consequences, had clawed his way from North Carolina poverty to Harlem significance through sheer will and calculated risk. He was not afraid of madness. He was afraid of being ordinary. When Bumpy finished his offer and sat back waiting for Frank's acceptance, waiting for the gratitude and loyalty that he had every right to expect, Frank Lucas took a breath and prepared to change everything. He looked at his mentor, his teacher, the man who had given him everything he had, and he said the one word that nobody expected, that nobody in their right mind would say when offered $1 million criminal emperor. He said no. The silence that followed Frank Lucas's refusal hung in the air like smoke, thick and suffocating, filled with implications that both men understood without needing to articulate them. In the criminal world where Bumpy Johnson reigned supreme, saying no to the king wasn't just unusual, it was unthinkable. Men had been killed for lesser acts of disrespect, had disappeared into the East River for even appearing to question Bumpy's authority. But Frank wasn't questioning Bumpy's authority. He was doing something far more dangerous. He was rejecting the entire system that Bumpy represented, the structure that had defined Harlem's criminal enterprises for generations. Bumpy's face remained impassive, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of something that might have been surprise, or perhaps disappointment. or maybe even a grudging respect for the sheer audacity of what Frank was doing. He leaned forward in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and when he spoke, his voice was measured and controlled. The voice of a man who had learned long ago that emotion was a weakness that got you killed. "Frank," Bumpy said, and there was a lifetime of history in the way he pronounced that single syllable. "You understand what you're turning down here? This isn't some small-time operation. This is everything. This is power, real power, the kind that makes men step aside when you walk down the street. This is money that your great-grandchildren will still be spending. This is respect." Frank nodded slowly, acknowledging the truth of what Bumpy was saying without backing down from his position. He had thought about this moment for months, had played out every possible scenario in his mind, had calculated the risks and rewards with the cold precision that had become his trademark. He knew that what he was about to propose could get him killed, could end his relationship with the one man who had been something close to a father to him, could leave him with nothing. But he also knew that accepting Bumpy's offer meant accepting a ceiling on his ambitions, meant forever being subordinate to the Italian Mafia, meant playing a game where the rules were written by people who would never see him as an equal. "I understand exactly what I'm turning down," Frank said, his voice calm and steady. "And I'm grateful, Bump, you know I am. Everything I have, everything I know, I learned from you, but what you're offering me is a chance to be the biggest dealer in Harlem, working for the Italians. And I'm not interested in being anybody's employee anymore, not even theirs." Bumpy's eyes narrowed slightly, and Frank could see the calculation happening behind them, the weighing of loyalty against ambition, of tradition against innovation. In another man, this might have been seen as betrayal, but Bumpy Johnson hadn't survived 4 decades in the criminal underworld by being inflexible or by surrounding himself with yes-men. He had recognized Frank's intelligence the beginning, had cultivated it, had taught him to think strategically and to question assumptions. Now those lessons were coming back in a way Bumpy hadn't anticipated. "You think you can do better than the Italians?" Bumpy asked, and there was genuine curiosity in his voice now, mixed with skepticism. "You think you can compete with organizations that have been running this business since before you were born?" "Frank, I've seen a lot of ambitious men in my time, and I've seen most of them in the ground." Frank took a breath, knowing that what he said next would determine everything. This was the moment where he either convinced Bumpy that he wasn't crazy, that he had actually thought this through, or where he marked himself as delusional and dangerous, someone who needed to be removed before he caused problems for everyone. The words he chose now would shape the rest of his life. "I don't want to compete with the Italians," Frank said carefully. "I want to go around them completely. I've been watching how this business works, studying every step of the chain, and the whole system is built on inefficiency. The heroin starts in Southeast Asia, gets processed in France, comes through Italian connections, passes through 5 or 6 hands before it reaches us, and by the time it hits the street, it's been cut so many times that nobody knows what they're actually buying. Everyone takes their percentage, everyone adds their markup, and in the end, we're selling garbage at premium prices." Bumpy listened intently, his expression giving nothing away, but Frank could tell he had his attention now. This was the Bumpy who had built an empire through intelligence rather than just violence, the strategic thinker who understood that the criminal who controlled information and supply chains was more powerful than the criminal who just controlled territory. Frank continued, his voice gaining confidence as he laid out the vision that had been forming in his mind for years. "What if we went straight to the source? What if we cut out the Turks, the Corsicans, the Italians, all of them? There's a war going on in Southeast Asia right now, and we've got 50,000 American troops in Vietnam. That whole region is drowning in opium. The Golden Triangle, Burma, Thailand, Laos, they're producing heroin that makes the Turkish stuff look like baby aspirin. And it's cheap, Bump. I mean incredibly cheap at the source." The idea was revolutionary, not just in its scope but in its implications. The heroin trade in America had been controlled by the Italian Mafia since the 1930s, built on connections that went back to the Sicilian families and their relationships with Turkish and French suppliers. It was an established system with established rules, and those rules had been enforced through violence and intimidation for decades. What Frank was proposing was nothing less than a complete restructuring of the entire drug trade, cutting out the traditional middlemen in a stab, lishing a direct pipeline from Southeast Asia to Harlem. But the brilliance of Frank's idea went beyond just cutting out middlemen. The Vietnam War had created a unique opportunity that Frank had recognized before anyone else. There were cargo planes flying from Southeast Asia to the United States every single day, filled with military equipment and returning soldiers. There were American servicemen in Vietnam who had access to local suppliers and who could be corrupted with the right amount of money. There was a massive military infrastructure that could be exploited by someone smart enough and bold enough to try. Bumpy sat back in his chair, his mind working through the implications of what Frank was proposing. He had to admit, grudgingly, that there was a certain elegance to the idea. If Frank could actually pull it off, and that was a massive if, the profit margins would be astronomical. They could sell heroin that was 98% pure at prices that undercut every other dealer in the city, and they would still make exponentially more money than they were making under the current system. More importantly, they would be independent, beholden to no one, building their own empire rather than renting space in someone else's. But Bumpy also understood the risks in a way that Frank, for all his intelligence, might not fully appreciate. The Italian Mafia wasn't going to just accept losing their most lucrative business without a fight. They had connections to politicians, judges, and police that went back generations. They had enforcement capabilities that made even Bumpy's organization look modest by comparison, and they had a reputation for extreme violence when their economic interests were threatened. Frank wasn't just proposing to compete with them, he was proposing to make them obsolete, and men who are made obsolete rarely go quietly. "You know what you're talking about here, Frank?" Bumpy asked, his voice serious. "You're talking about going to war with the most powerful criminal organization in America. You're talking about making enemies of people who have been running this city since before either of us was born. I've worked with the Italians for 30 years, maintained relationships, paid my tributes, stayed in my lane. I'm still alive because I understood that some battles you don't fight, some enemies you don't make." Frank nodded, acknowledging the validity of Bumpy's concerns. "I know the risks, Bump, but I also know that the world is changing. The Italians have been comfortable for too long, taking their percentage without having to work for it, assuming that nobody would ever challenge them because nobody ever has. But that kind of complacency creates vulnerability. The way I see it, by the time they realize what's happening, by the time they understand that we're not just another crew they can squash, we'll already be too big, too established, too valuable to too many people." There was a logic to what Frank was saying. A cold, calculating logic that appealed to the strategic part of Bumpy's mind, even as the cautious part warned him about the dangers. Frank was right that the Italians had become complacent, right that the system was inefficient, right that there was an opportunity created by the Vietnam War that might never come again. But he was also young, and youth often mistakes audacity for wisdom, mistakes the ability to imagine success for the ability to achieve it. Bumpy was silent for a long moment, his mind working through scenarios and possibilities, calculating odds and outcomes in the way that had kept him alive and powerful for 4 decades. Finally he spoke, and his words were measured and careful, the words of a man who had learned to be precise when precision mattered. "If you do this, Frank, you do it on your own. I can't be part of it. Can't give you my blessing, can't protect you if things go sideways. I've built my empire by knowing which rules I can break and which ones I can't, and going to war with the Italians is a rule I can't break, not at my age, not with my health. But I'm also not going to stop you. You've earned the right to make your own decisions. Even if I think those decisions might get you killed." It was as close to a blessing as Frank was going to get. A tacit acknowledgement that while Bumpy couldn't support what Frank was proposing, he also respected him enough not to stand in his way. In the complex calculus of criminal relationships, this was significant. Bumpy could have ordered Frank killed for his presumption, could have moved to crush any independent operation before it started, could have used his relationships with the Italians to make Frank's life impossible. Instead, he was stepping aside, neither helping nor hindering, giving Frank the space to either succeed spectacularly or fail catastrophically. Frank understood the gift he was being given, understood that Bumpy was showing him a kind of respect that few men in his position ever received. He stood up, extended his hand, and when Bumpy took it, there was a weight to the handshake that transcended the simple physical gesture. It was an acknowledgement between two men who understood the stakes, who respected each other even as they were choosing different paths, who recognized that this moment marked the end of one relationship and potentially the beginning of something entirely new. As Frank left that room, walking back out into the noise and chaos of the club, his mind was already racing ahead to the next steps, to the logistics and planning that would be required to turn his vision into reality. He knew that what he had just done was either the smartest decision of his life or the decision that would get him killed. There was no middle ground, no safe compromise, no way to partially implement what he was planning. He was all in now, committed to a path that would either make him a legend or make him a cautionary tale. The first challenge was obvious. He dead to get to Southeast Asia, needed to establish connections with suppliers in the Golden Triangle, needed to see firsthand if the opportunity he had identified actually existed in the way he imagined. But he couldn't just fly to Vietnam and start asking around about heroin. He needed cover, needed a reason to be there that wouldn't immediately raise suspicions, needed access to the military infrastructure that would make his smuggling operation possible. Frank spent the next several months carefully building the foundation for his plan. He made connections with low-level criminals who had military experience, men who had served in Vietnam and knew the territory, knew the corruption, knew where to find the people who could make things happen. He studied the logistics of military transport, learning about cargo manifests and inspection procedures and the weak points in the system where contraband could be introduced. He set aside money, his own money earned through years of working for Bumpy, building a war chest that would finance his initial trip and the establishment of his supply chain in early 1969, less than a year after Bumpy had died of a heart attack. Frank Lucas boarded a plane for Southeast Asia. He traveled as a businessman carrying legitimate credentials and cover stories that would explain his presence in a war zone. He had letters of introduction from people who owed him favors, connections that would open doors that would otherwise remain closed. And he had a singular focus, a determination that bordered on obsession, to prove that what he had envisioned was not just possible but inevitable. The Golden Triangle in 1969 was a region that existed outside the normal rules of civilization. The borders between Burma, Thailand, and Laos were porous and largely uncontrolled, patrolled by armies of various warlords and drug traffickers who had established their own fiefdoms in the chaos. The opium trade had been going on for centuries, but the Vietnam War had transformed the scale and sophistication of the operation. Chinese chemists who had fled mainland China during the Communist Revolution had brought their expertise to the region, establishing laboratories that could turn raw opium into heroin of unprecedented purity. Frank spent weeks in the region, traveling from one operation to another, meeting with suppliers and manufacturers, negotiating prices and discussing logistics. He was careful, methodical, taking his time to understand the landscape before committing to any particular relationship. He learned about the various power players in the region, about who could be trusted and who couldn't, about the complex web of corruption that allowed the heroin trade to flourish despite the nominal presence of law enforcement. What Frank discovered exceeded even his optimistic projections. The heroin being produced in the Golden Triangle was 98% pure, more potent than anything available in the United States. And the price at the source was absurdly low, a fraction of what the Italian Mafia was paying for their Turkish supplies. If Frank could establish a reliable supply chain, if he could solve the problem of transport, he could flood the American market with a product that was both higher quality and lower priced than anything the competition could offer. It would be a revolution, a complete disruption of the existing order, but the transport problem was significant. Getting heroin from Southeast Asia to New York required moving it thousands of miles across international borders, through customs inspections and law enforcement checkpoints, past systems that were specifically designed to stop exactly what Frank was trying to do. The Italian Mafia had solved this problem through corruption and established relationships built over decades. Frank had neither the time nor the connections to replicate that approach. The solution, when it came to him, was both audacious and brilliant in its simplicity. American soldiers who died in Vietnam were being sent home in coffins, shipped through military transport that received minimal inspection because of the respect accorded to fallen servicemen. Frank realized that those coffins, those sacred vessels that carried the bodies of American heroes, could also carry heroin. It was a plan that required corruption at multiple levels, that depended on people being willing to desecrate the dead for profit, that violated every notion of honor and respect that American society held dear. Frank understood that what he was planning was monstrous by any conventional moral standard. He understood that if the American public ever discovered that heroin was being smuggled in the coffins of dead soldiers, the outrage would be overwhelming, the backlash would be severe, and his own life would be worth nothing. But Frank Lucas had learned long ago, watching his cousin murdered by the Ku Klux Klan, watching his father work himself to death in fields he would never own, that conventional morality was a luxury afforded to people who had the privilege of choice. He had no such luxury, and he had no intention of apologizing for doing whatever was necessary to achieve his goals. The mechanics of Frank Lucas's operation were staggering in their complexity and breathtaking in their execution. What he constructed over the next several years wasn't just a drug smuggling ring. It was a vertically integrated criminal enterprise that controlled every aspect of production and distribution, from the poppy fields of Southeast Asia to the street corners of Harlem. It was a business model that would have impressed any MBA, executed with a precision that would have been admired in any boardroom, and it made Frank Lucas richer and more powerful than even he had dared to imagine. The first shipment arrived in 1970, hidden in the coffins of dead American soldiers, transported through military channels that Frank had corrupted with carefully distributed bribes and threats. The heroin was 98% pure, exactly as promised, and Frank immediately understood that he was holding in his hands the power to reshape the entire drug trade in New York City. But he also understood that raw power needed to be wielded strategically, that flooding the market too quickly would attract attention from both law enforcement and competitors, that success required patience and planning. Frank branded his heroin Blue Magic, a name that captured both its quality and its distinctiveness. While other dealers were selling heroin that was 10 or 15% pure, cut with quinine and lactose and whatever else their suppliers used to maximize profits, Frank was selling product that was so pure it was actually dangerous to users who had built up tolerance to the diluted garbage that normally flooded the streets. Addicts who shot up their usual dose of Blue Magic ended up overdosing because they weren't used to heroin that was actually heroin. But rather than seeing this as a problem, Frank recognized it as a marketing opportunity. The overdoses, while tragic, sent a message to every addict in New York City that Blue Magic was the real thing, that this was heroin like they had never experienced before, that Frank Lucas was selling something fundamentally different from what anyone else had available. Word spread through the junkie grapevine with viral intensity, and within months, Blue Magic had become the most sought-after brand of heroin in the city. Why, the economics were staggering. Frank was buying heroin in Southeast Asia for $4,000 per kilogram. By the time that same kilogram was cut, packaged, and sold on the streets of Harlem, it generated approximately $300,000 in revenue. Even after paying for transport, bribes, distribution, and the various costs of running a criminal enterprise, Frank was clearing profits that made Bumpy Johnson's $1 million-a-year operation look modest by comparison. At his peak, Frank Lucas was generating an estimated $1 million per day, an amount of money so large it became difficult to manage, difficult to hide, difficult to even count. Frank's organization grew to include dozens of direct employees and hundreds of street-level dealers, all operating under strict rules that Frank enforced with a combination of generous compensation and terrifying violence. He paid his people better than any other dealer in the city, offered health insurance and bonuses, and a level of professionalism that was unheard of in the drug trade. But he also made it clear that betrayal, theft, or incompetence would be met with immediate and brutal consequences. Frank had learned from Bumpy Johnson that respect was built on a foundation of both carrots and sticks, and he wielded both with calculated precision. The family element of Frank's organization was crucial to his success and would later prove to be one of his vulnerabilities. He brought his brothers and cousins up from North Carolina, gave them positions of authority in his operation, created a tight-knit organization bound by blood as well as business. This approach had advantages. Family members were less likely to betray you, more likely to be loyal, more invested in the overall success of the enterprise. But it also meant that Frank's organization was insular, closed off from outside talent, and ultimately limited by the capabilities of his relatives, rather than the best possible people for each position. Frank's success did not go unnoticed by the Italian Mafia, who watched with growing alarm as this upstart black dealer systematically dismantled their monopoly on the heroin trade. Initially, they didn't believe the reports they were hearing, couldn't accept that someone had figured out a way to bypass their carefully constructed supply chain, couldn't imagine that a black man from North Carolina had outmaneuvered criminal organizations that had been operating since the 19th century. But as Frank's market share grew, as more and more dealers switched to selling blue magic because their customers demanded it, the Italians were forced to confront the reality that their business model was becoming obsolete. The Mafia's response was predictable and violent. They sent emissaries to Frank, offering him a deal, buy from them or die. It was the same offer they had made to countless criminals over the years, the same ultimatum that had always worked because nobody had the resource or the audacity to stand up to the Italian mob. But Frank Lucas was not like other dealers. He had built his organization specifically to be independent of the Italians, had constructed supply chains and distribution networks that didn't depend on their approval, had accumulated enough wealth and power that he could defend his territory. The negotiations between Frank and the Italian families were tense and dangerous. Frank understood that he was walking a tightrope, that one wrong move could result in a war that would destroy his organization and likely get him killed. But he also understood that the Italians, despite their bluster and threats, were in a weaker position than they appeared. Their heroin was inferior to his, their prices were higher, and their traditional customers were abandoning them in droves. Frank had something the Italians desperately needed, a connection to a supply source that they couldn't access, and that gave him leverage. The eventual agreement between Frank and the Italians was unprecedented in the history of New York's criminal underworld. Rather than submitting to their authority, rather than accepting a subordinate position in their hierarchy, Frank negotiated as an equal. He agreed to respect their territories in certain neighborhoods, to not actively recruit their dealers, to maintain a facade of cooperation that allowed the Italians to save face. In return, they agreed to leave him alone, to not interfere with his operations, to accept the Harlem and the other predominantly black neighborhoods were his domain. It was a compromise that neither side was entirely happy with, but it was also a recognition of reality. Frank had become too big to crush without starting a war that would cost both sides dearly. The Italians, for all their power and connections, couldn't compete with the quality and price of blue magic, couldn't match Frank's direct connection to Southeast Asian suppliers, couldn't reclaim market share without essentially starting over from scratch. And Frank, while powerful in his own right, understood that the Italians still had political and law enforcement connections that could make his life difficult if they chose to leverage them. But while Frank had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of mafia politics, he had failed to fully account for another enemy that was ultimately more dangerous: law enforcement. The Drug Enforcement Administration, newly formed in 1973 from a consolidation of various federal drug enforcement agencies, had made Frank Lucas a priority target. They watched him with sophisticated surveillance techniques, built cases against his organization with the patience of hunters tracking dangerous prey, and slowly, methodically, constructed the evidence that would eventually bring down his entire empire. The agent who would ultimately prove to be Frank's nemesis was a detective named Richie Roberts, an honest cop in a notoriously corrupt department, a man who couldn't be ought or intimidated, who pursued Frank with a single-minded determination that matched Frank's own obsessive attention to his business. Roberts recognized that Frank's organization was different from other drug operations, more sophisticated, more disciplined, more careful about operational security. Breaking it would require unconventional investigative techniques, patience, and the ability to resist the temptation to settle for easy arrests of street-level dealers in favor of building a case against the entire organization. The investigation into Frank Lucas's operation took years, involved hundreds of hours of surveillance, wiretaps of phones and meeting places, the slow cultivation of informants who could provide inside information about how the organization worked. Roberts built his case brick by brick, documenting shipments and payments, tracking money through the various front businesses and real estate investments that Frank used to launder his profits, connecting the dots between street-level dealers and the Kingpin who controlled everything. Frank, for his part, was aware that he was being investigated but underestimated both the scope of the investigation and the determination of the people pursuing him. He had become accustomed to corruption, had operated for years in an environment where police and prosecutors could be bought, where evidence could be made to disappear, where witnesses could be intimidated into silence. The idea that someone would pursue him with genuine dedication to justice rather than personal enrichment was foreign to his experience, and it created a blind spot in his usually excellent instincts for danger. The lifestyle that Frank cultivated during his years of success also contributed to his eventual downfall. Despite his intelligence and strategic thinking, Frank had a weakness for status and recognition that ran counter to the careful invisibility that successful criminals need to maintain. He bought expensive cars and clothes, attended high-profile events, made himself visible in ways that drew attention from both law enforcement and competitors. The most famous example of this was when he attended the 1971 fight of the century between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier, sitting ringside in a chinchilla coat and matching hat that cost over $50,000. That coat, that moment of flamboyant display, would later be identified by law enforcement as the moment when they fully understood who Frank Lucas was and what he represented. Up until then, he had been a name in reports, a suspected kingpin that they were building a case against, but seeing him at Madison Square Garden in that coat, seeing him comfortable and confident among celebrities and power brokers, drove home the reality that this was not just another drug dealer, but a major criminal figure who had become wealthy and powerful enough to operate openly. Frank's brother, Huey Lucas, would later tell investigators that Frank's ego was his greatest weakness, that his need to be recognized and respected as a successful businessman rather than hidden criminal was the crack in his otherwise formidable armor. Bumpy Johnson had taught Frank about strategy and discipline, about the importance of maintaining a low profile and letting your actions speak louder than your appearance. But Bumpy had also taught Frank about commanding respect, about the importance of being feared and admired, and Frank had internalized those lessons in a way that ultimately proved destructive. The actual arrest, when it finally came in January 1975, was anticlimactic in its execution, but devastating in its scope. Federal agents armed with warrants descended on Frank's property simultaneously, executing a coordinated operation that had been planned with military precision. They arrested Frank, his brothers, his associates, and dozens of street-level dealers all within a span of hours, effectively decapitating his entire organization in a single operation. They seized millions of dollars in cash, drugs, vehicles, and property, confiscating the physical evidence of an empire that had operated with impunity for years. Frank's trial was a media sensation, a glimpse into a criminal underworld that most Americans had only imagined existed. The prosecution presented evidence of an organization that had smuggled over $50 million worth of heroin into the United States, that had corrupted military personnel and law enforcement officers, that had distributed drugs that had contributed to thousands of overdose deaths. The details were shocking, the scope was staggering, and the public was simultaneously horrified and fascinated by the story of a poor kid from North Carolina who had built a criminal empire that rivaled anything in American history. But it was Frank's decision after his conviction that would define his legacy in ways that his criminal success never could. Facing a 70-year sentence that would effectively be a death sentence for a man in his 40s, Frank made the choice that Bumpy Johnson had taught him to never make. He decided to cooperate with federal authorities. He became an informant, providing information about corrupt law enforcement officers, about other criminals and their operations, about the vast network of corruption and criminality that existed at every level of New York's criminal justice system. Frank's cooperation resulted in the arrest and conviction of dozens of corrupt NYPD officers, including three-quarters of the Special Investigations Unit that was supposed to be fighting the drug trade but was instead facilitating it for profit. His testimony exposed a level of corruption that shocked even cynical New Yorkers, revealing that the war on drugs was being undermined from within by the very people who were supposed to be fighting it. The information Frank provided was so valuable, so comprehensive, that it forced a complete reorganization of how drug enforcement was conducted. In New York City, in exchange for his cooperation, Frank's sentence was reduced to 15 years, and he was released after serving just 5. He returned to a Harlem that had changed dramatically in his absence, to a drug trade that had moved on without him, to a life where his legendary status was forever tainted by the label of informant. In the criminal world where he had once been a king, cooperating with law enforcement was the ultimate betrayal, an unforgivable sin that marked him as a pariah forever. The question that has fascinated criminologists, journalists, and historians ever since is whether Frank Lucas's decision to refuse Bumpy Johnson's offer and strike out on his own was ultimately worth it. He achieved a level of wealth and power that most criminals never even imagine, built an organization that revolutionized the drug trade, proved that the existing system could be challenged and beaten, but he also lost everything, spent years in prison, betrayed the code that had defined his entire life, and lived his final years as a marginal figure, giving interviews and telling stories about glory days that seemed increasingly distant and irrelevant. Frank Lucas died in 2019 at the age of 88, an old man whose legendary status was always complicated by the choices he had made, both in building his empire and in tearing it down from the inside. His funeral was sparsely attended, a stark contrast to the send-offs given to criminal legends like Bumpy Johnson, who funerals had been events where Harlem came out to mourn and celebrate. Frank's cooperation with law enforcement had made him rich in ways that money never could, had bought him his freedom and years of life that he would not otherwise have had, but it had cost him something that no amount of wealth or time could replace. The legacy of Frank Lucas is not easily categorized or simply understood. He was a brilliant strategist who saw opportunities that others missed, a ruthless businessman who built an empire through intelligence and violence in equal measure, a man who refused to accept the limitations that society and circumstance had placed on him. But he was also a drug dealer whose product contributed to immeasurable suffering, whose organization facilitated addiction and death, whose success was built on the misery of the most vulnerable members of society. When Frank said no to Bumpy Johnson that night in 1968, he set in motion a chain of events that would reshape the criminal landscape of New York City, prove that the seemingly unbreakable monopoly of the Italian Mafia could be challenged and broken, demonstrate that innovation and audacity could triumph over tradition and established power. But he also embarked on a path that would lead to betrayal, imprisonment, and a complicated legacy that resists simple heroic or villainous narratives. The story of Frank Lucas is ultimately a very American story, a tale of ambition and innovation, of refusing to accept the role to hat society assigned you, of building something from nothing through intelligence and will. But it is also a story about the costs of that ambition, about the moral compromises required to achieve success in systems that are fundamentally corrupt, about the price that is ultimately paid when you build your empire on foundations of human suffering. That night in 1968, when Frank Lucas looked at his mentor and said no to a $1 million criminal empire because he wanted to build something bigger, something that belonged entirely to him, he made a choice that defined not just his life, but an entire era of American crime. He became a legend, certainly, but legends are complicated things, admired and condemned in equal measure, studied and debated long after the men who created them are gone. Frank Lucas got exactly what he wanted when he refused Bumpy Johnson's offer. He transcended the limitations of his circumstances and built an empire that nobody thought possible. But whether that empire was worth the cost, whether saying no was the smartest decision of his life or the beginning of his ultimate downfall, remains a question without a simple answer, a puzzle that continues to fascinate anyone who studies the intersection of crime, ambition, and the American dream.